Sometimes telling genres apart can be tricky. Oftentimes, storytellers will mix genres or let their work bleed over the established lines of convention. Mixing elements from different genres can sometimes even create results that are more interesting or emotionally impactful than either of the individual niches could be on their own. But any good artist will tell you that, in order to blend these elements well, we must first understand how each of them works on an individual level. In this video, I specifically wanted to try and better understand science fiction and fantasy, at least on the most basic level, through analyzing the Star Wars franchise. Star Wars is famous for having elements of both science fiction and fantasy, and contains many potential lessons for how to execute these genres, as well as sometimes how to not execute them. Hopefully, having a better understanding of these genres, at least on a very basic level, will serve as a starting point from which writers and artists might dream and create with them in new and unique ways, whether keeping the genres apart or by blending them together. Merriam-Webster's College Dictionary defines science fiction as, quote, fiction dealing principally with the impact of actual or imagined science on society or individuals, or having a scientific factor as an essential orienting component. While it's considered speculative fiction and has similar literary roots to fantasy, science fiction tends to be more grounded. Even the most outlandish science fiction stories, when written well, tend to deal more with the moral, social, or political implications of technology and scientific advancement. In this case, I personally believe that the original trilogy leans a little bit more into the realm of fantasy, while the pendulum swings a little bit for the prequel trilogy and Clone Wars in regards to a more socio-political science fiction angle. But that's just my point of view. Regardless of how much Star Wars leans into science fiction elements, there is no denying that it has many of them. So the question shifts from, is Star Wars science fiction? To, when we do make it science fiction, how do we write that well? Well, to start, you can't just throw concepts in there and say, this is a thing now, at least not if you want your audience to ask a million questions. For instance, when you say, this story exists in a virtual world called the Matrix, leaving it there as just a prop or a setting would be extremely unsatisfying. It is far more interesting to say something like, this story takes place in a virtual world called the Matrix, and here's what that means for our characters. Here's all the stuff they can do. Going at least one level deeper and asking yourself the question, what does this technology do, and how would that impact my world and the characters living in it, will go a long way into making your story more satisfying. And if you're going to mix both science fiction and fantasy, you can't just say, it's the Force, when something doesn't make logical sense. It's true that you have a little more leeway with how scientifically accurate your technology, biology, or ecology is. And let's face it, Star Wars isn't hard science fiction and doesn't have the best scientific accuracy. But you still have to go a little bit deeper into the concepts you introduce on some level. An excellent example is the lightsaber. Of course, lightsabers are pretty much scientifically impossible, but especially in the books, TV shows, and video games, they have a deep history, construction, and religious meaning for the Jedi. There's an incredible depth and complexity to the building of a Jedi's lightsaber and how it factors into the training of a Jedi Knight. If you have the time for that sort of thing, I highly recommend checking out the lore for lightsabers. It's fascinating stuff. Star Wars: The Clone Wars became legendary for doing this with the concepts introduced in the prequel trilogy. Dave Filoni was always asking his crew to go deeper and ask difficult questions about the Star Wars universe and how it worked. For instance, clones aren't droids. They have their own hopes, ambitions, and dreams, which leads to asking hard questions like, how did the clones feel about the war? How did the clones feel about serving under Jedi? What was it like to be bred exclusively for war? What was it like being brainwashed into killing the Jedi you served? These are not easy questions to ask, let alone answer, and yet in the spirit of true science fiction, Filoni encouraged everyone who worked on the show to not shy away from these concepts and explore every aspect of the good, the bad, and the ugly of what they mean for the galaxy as a whole, to always go deeper than the surface level. Because science fiction isn't always focused on the technology or the concepts of science itself, so much as how humans react and interact with them, and what that means for us as a species. You always have to ask more questions and go deeper than the surface level. Now, fantasy, when done right, and it often isn't, has the potential for just as much depth and nuance as science fiction, but in a very different way. Fantasy usually tackles deep human issues through the use of emotional, metaphorical, allegorical, or symbolic storytelling. Fantasy should have something profound to say about the world and our place in it, just like science fiction, albeit in a more abstract way. After all, that's what makes fantasy's predecessor, the classic myth, so compelling to audiences even hundreds of years after they've been written. Good modern fantasy shares that timeless sense of storytelling for the human condition. Of course, there's definitely bad fantasy out there, with a major problem for the genre being the concept of deus ex machina, or using magic as a catch-all to lazily solve whatever plot problem comes your way. As a result, the genre has developed an unfair reputation at times for being lowbrow or childish. But I honestly don't think anyone can legitimately accuse the Tolkiens of being lowbrow or childish with their execution. The truth of the matter is that it's not the genre itself that's a problem, but rather its execution. The execution must be done well, and that's a tricky thing to do. Clever writing takes work, and crafting a fantasy world and narrative with depth and nuance can be a Herculean task. Which is why when Star Wars pulls it off well, we notice, and when it doesn't, we unfortunately notice even more. Now, there's a lot that goes into telling a good fantasy story, but it's probably most important to take note of the one topic that seems to irk storytellers and audiences the most: convenient, low-effort plot fixes. You can have magic, I mean the Force, in your story, but you can't let it solve all your narrative problems. Because let's be honest, the Force is what we fantasy readers call a magic system, albeit a very soft one, and there are certain guidelines and rules that one needs to follow when writing these. The rules of your world can be whatever you want them to be, but they must remain internally consistent. Once an expectation has been set, you cannot break it unless you have an incredibly thorough, logical, and well thought through reason why things should change. No matter how outlandish your world's magic is, you must remain internally consistent. You can have space wizards that choke people with their minds across vast distances as long as you make it clear to the audience early on that something like this is possible, and that the precedents you set remain constant. And in a way that makes fantasy a little bit more difficult to write, because you not only have to follow a certain set of rules in order to keep your audience engaged, but you must also create the rules in the first place. And creating believable rules for outlandish powers is no simple task. Good fantasy is always striking that perfect balance between escapism and realism. You need to have enough fantastical elements in your story to provide the audience with a wondrous place to escape to, while simultaneously providing enough grounding in realism to make the audience believe, even if just for the time it takes you to tell your story, that the fantastical place they're visiting could be real. It's a grand illusion, and one that takes considerable effort to achieve. Your world building must be well thought out, interconnected, and have some grounding in the real world to act as a compass around which the audience's suspension of disbelief can navigate. And Star Wars has the potential for grounded fantasy world building on the level of Tolkien, where every race, culture, weapon, political system, religion, and philosophy can be explored in an almost never-ending ripple through the universe. The amount of potential for exploring these concepts and fleshing them out in new and unique ways is astounding, and fans have been reaping the benefits of that type of storytelling for years through extensions to the universe like books and video games. Even the mainstream audiences of Star Wars have been immersed in that potential with the rising popularity of Star Wars television in both its animated and live-action forms. In both science fiction and fantasy, real effort is required to craft a compelling story. A storyteller cannot be lazy with either of them. No matter what genre one chooses to lean into with a Star Wars story, the fact remains that one must always go deeper. A storyteller must be mindful and ask questions, to not be afraid to explore the deeper meaning of their writing in a profound way. Both genres have a responsibility to go beyond the surface and always reach for more complexity, nuance, and depth. A combination of these two genres sometimes requires even more effort than either of them would on their own. In my opinion, what makes Star Wars so unique is its ability to exist in both the science fiction and fantasy genres simultaneously, and to do it artfully. There's something so special about a story that provides the escapism of fantasy, while also delving into the deeper nuances and questions often found in science fiction. It's a big universe, and there's room for both science fiction and fantasy junkies to stretch their legs and find stories that they love. Sometimes, there's a beautiful marriage of both that satisfies fans that normally wouldn't be interested in either, and that's an amazing thing to see. There are other space fantasy stories that blend these concepts well, but Star Wars is unique in the pure cultural impact it has with its fandom. The breadth and scope of this franchise's cultural saturation is mind-boggling, and new people are being introduced to science fiction and fantasy through it every day. And in my opinion, that amount of potential impact has a responsibility to understand the origins of what they're writing and execute future work with care and respect. Because something this special doesn't happen every day. This is something that is worth our time and attention. Thank you for watching. May the Force be with you, always.